5:42 local time. Eastern approach to the Strait of Hormuz. The first sign of trouble did not appear on the horizon. It appeared on a screen. Inside the Combat Information Center of the lead U.S. escort, the air search display was already busy with the usual morning picture. Routine traffic patterns, patrol routes, and familiar regional surveillance tracks. Then a new cluster emerged high to the southwest. The returns were large, evenly spaced, speed steady. Too deliberate to belong to civilian traffic, and too significant to dismiss. The watch supervisor leaned closer to the scope. For 2 seconds, no one spoke. Then, the identification team went to work. Voices short and precise. Multiple heavy airborne contacts. High altitude, stable formation, moving toward the Hormuz corridor. Up on the bridge, the sea still looked calm. A flat gray light spread across the water. Commercial vessels stayed in their lanes. Off the port bow, an Iranian patrol craft shadowed the American formation from a careful distance, just outside the point that would trigger an immediate reaction. From the outside, nothing seemed different. Inside CIC, everything had changed. The data link filled first. Then the voice circuit followed. An E-2D Hawkeye orbiting farther out pushed confirmation into the network. These tracks were not random. They were part of a coordinated package, moving with support, timing, and discipline. Moments later, the classification became clear. B-52 aircraft. No one in the room showed much reaction. None was needed. The meaning was obvious. The aircraft were still high, still far off, still flying well outside any reckless profile. But their appearance instantly changed the geometry of the entire strait. Every radar site along the coast would see them. Every patrol commander in the area would be forced to reassess. A corridor that had felt tense only minutes earlier now sat beneath the weight of strategic air power. The tactical action officer gave the next order in a calm, level tone. Raise posture. Hold current course. Track all Iranian surface movement. The destroyer did not turn, and that mattered. There was no dramatic maneuver, no blaring alarm, no visible rush on deck. That was exactly the point. The American formation continued forward at the measured pace of a force that had expected this moment before it arrived. On the surface picture, 2 U.S. escorts maintained their spacing around the central transit lane, while optical systems shifted toward the nearest Iranian contacts. At 5:47, the Iranian patrol craft to the north picked up speed. It was not a direct run, not yet, but its bow wake sharpened and its track bent just enough to show intent. On another screen, 3 smaller fast boats closer to shore peeled away from a loose cluster and moved southeast, angling for a clearer look at the American ships and the airspace above them. Bridge watchstanders on the U.S. side reported the movement. CIC marked it immediately. Electronic support teams also logged rising emissions from the coast. Iranian radar activity was building in layers now, site after site, as though the shoreline itself were waking up. Overhead, the main aircraft package continued forward. Then the operators noticed something else. Trailing behind the B-52s, still farther back and not yet centered in the tactical picture, were additional returns, larger than fighters, slower than escorts, flying in disciplined intervals. At first, they resembled distant support traffic buried inside the broader formation. Then the spacing repeated, and then it repeated again. The air controller narrowed the filter and stared. Additional heavy tracks behind the primary group. The supervisor turned. Type, unknown. Transport profile, multiple aircraft. That changed the atmosphere in the room. Bombers alone could signal pressure. Bombers followed by transport-type aircraft suggested planning, sequence, and a next step already in motion. Out on the bridge wing, binoculars remained fixed on the water because in Hormuz, that is where danger usually shows itself first. But the real shift that morning was unfolding far above the visible line, where the air picture had become far too organized to dismiss as theater. At 5:52, one of the Iranian fast boats pushed farther out than the others, cutting across the dark blue water in a hard diagonal line. Its movement was assertive enough to draw attention, but controlled enough to remain technically short of provocation. The American destroyer responded the way disciplined crews are trained to respond, by documenting everything and changing nothing that might be read as uncertainty. Range calls came in. Bearing updates followed. Electro-optical cameras locked on. The captain remained on the bridge in silence, watching the boat, then the sky, then the commercial lanes ahead. Above them, the first B-52s reached the outer edge of the corridor. Not descending, not rushing, simply arriving. At 5:57, the unknown aircraft behind them became clearer on U.S. displays. Transport-class signatures, multiple aircraft. Their route aligned a little too neatly with the open water approaches east of Hormuz. One operator spoke without looking away from the screen. This is not just a bomber pass. No one replied because no reply was necessary. The Iranian boats were still maneuvering, coastal radars were still sweeping, the American ships were still holding steady on course. But the shape of the operation had finally revealed its deeper layer. The bombers were only the leading edge. Something else was following behind them, and whatever it was being brought into Hormuz for a reason. 6:04 local time, air corridor east of Hormuz. By then, no one inside the American tactical network was treating the incoming formation as a routine overflight. The bomber tracks were already established high above the corridor, broad and deliberate, holding the kind of altitude that projected control without pushing the situation into chaos. Below them, the surface picture remained tense, but contained. Iranian patrol craft still shadowed from offset angles. Fast boats remained active along the outer edge of the waterline. So far, no one had crossed the line. Then the aircraft trailing the B-52s came fully into focus. Inside CIC, the picture on the air display had become too clear to misinterpret. Multiple heavy transport aircraft, even spacing, steady movement along a route that had clearly been prepared and secured before they entered it. Support elements were layered around them with precise timing. Radar coverage overlapped cleanly. Communication stayed brief and controlled. The aircraft above were not reacting on the fly. They were shaping a corridor. One American controller studied the display for a moment longer than usual, then keyed the circuit. Air corridor is being established. The words settled over the room with quiet certainty. The bridge received it next. No visible reaction, just a slight tightening in posture. Lookouts remained fixed on their optics. Helm held steady. Engine output did not change. The destroyer's wake carved a straight white line through the morning water as the formation pressed ahead as though this had always been the expected pattern of the day. At 6:06, the Iranian side adjusted again. A larger patrol vessel to the north reduced speed slightly and turned just enough to improve its angle on the sky. Three fast boats to the east spread wider apart, no longer moving as a loose group. Now they seemed to be probing for approach lanes, testing the edges of American intent. From shore, emissions continued to build. Search radars, fire control support systems, command relay traffic. The coastline was no longer simply watching, it was measuring. Above, the U.S. package tightened further. An MH-60 helicopter lifted from one of the escorts and climbed out over the water, nose pointed toward the eastern sector. It did not rush. It extended the American view. Higher overhead, combat air patrol remained on station, unseen from the deck but present on every screen that mattered. The B-52s held their line above the developing pattern like a ceiling of steel. Then, the first transport began to descend. Not sharply, not enough to trigger panic, just enough for every operator watching the air picture to understand that the next phase was no longer hypothetical. Inside the aircraft, that phase had already begun. Crew chiefs moved through the cargo bay. Loadmasters gave anchor lines and equipment one final check. Red light washed over helmets, harnesses, and still, focused faces. Every buckle had already been inspected. Every sequence had already been practiced. No speeches were needed. No explanations were necessary. The roar inside the fuselage drowned out everything except hand signals and muscle memory. Back over the water, Iran made its first direct attempt to break the sense of control. A warning transmission came over the military distress frequency, demanding that unidentified aircraft alter course and leave the area. The call was sharp, official, and clearly meant to be heard by every receiver within range. The American side did not argue. There was no extended exchange, only short procedural replies from aviation controllers maintaining separation and asserting safe transit within the operating lane. The transports continued inbound. At 6:09, the nearest fast boat accelerated again, this time pushing farther out from the Iranian side of the waterline. Its wake brightened in the early sunlight. Another followed. The move was quick enough to draw close attention, but measured enough to stop short of a direct intercept. CIC tagged both tracks immediately. Surface contacts increasing speed, maintain record, continue air priority. That was the rhythm now. Surface activity monitored, air mission protected. At 6:10, one of the transport aircraft reached the entry point of the corridor. Its rear ramp opened. On the shipboard optical feed, the distance reduced everything to shape and shadow. But inside the aircraft, the atmosphere changed instantly. The noise intensified as the slipstream tore through the open ramp. Red light held for a final moment. Harnesses were checked again by instinct, not uncertainty. Men rose from the side benches in sequence and moved aft. Each clipped into the system. Each took the exact place assigned long before the wheels ever left the runway. The loadmaster checked the line, then looked toward the opening. Green was close. Below, the Strait of Hormuz suddenly seemed smaller. Warships, patrol craft, merchant routes, and surveillance arcs were compressed into one narrow geography of consequence. Iranian crews on the water could now see the American air package in its full structure overhead. Not only bombers, not only escorts, something heavier, something more deliberate, a pattern that suggested insertion. On the destroyer's bridge, one lookout raised binoculars toward the distant formation. In CIC, nobody spoke without a reason. The room had become a machine. At 6:11, the transport crossed the release line. Inside the aircraft, the light changed. A jumpmaster turned, gave the signal, and the first line of paratroopers stepped into the roaring open sky above Hormuz. 6:12 local time, over the eastern corridor of Hormuz. The first paratrooper vanished into the slipstream without hesitation. 1 second later, the next followed. Then another. Then another. From the rear ramp, the jump line became a steady, mechanical flow of bodies into open air. Each man disappeared into the wind for the briefest moment before his parachute opened above the strait. Inside the cargo bay, there was no wasted motion, no theatrical shouting. Only the hard rhythm of training carried out under weight, noise, and time pressure. Green light, step, exit, clear. Outside, the sky changed shape. What had been a clean military corridor only moments earlier now began to fill with descending canopies, opening in sequence over the water approaches east of Hormuz. White chutes and darker tactical canopies spread across the morning air in disciplined intervals. Each one marked the exact timing of a plan that had moved from signal to execution without pause. From the surface, the effect was immediate. One of the Iranian fast boats that had been pressing outward was the first to slow, not because someone ordered it to, but because the scene overhead had become impossible to ignore. Another boat held speed for 2 seconds more, then edged slightly offline as its crew looked up through spray and glare toward the descending formation. Even from sea level, even through distance and motion, the scale of coordination was obvious. The shock was not in chaos, it was in precision. High above the drop lane, the B-52 still held altitude. Broad dark silhouettes moving with calm steadiness across the upper layer of the operation. They did not dive. They did not scatter. They remained what they had been from the beginning of that morning. Weight in the sky. Pressure without disorder. Below them, the transports carried out the insertion. Higher and farther out, fighter cover maintained its screen. On the water, U.S. escorts held their course through the strait, while an MH-60 expanded the maritime picture beneath the descending troops. Air, sea, timing. Everything was connected now. At 6:13, the first parachutes drifted lower toward the designated drop zone east of the busiest transit lanes. The wind over the water was stronger than it had appeared from altitude. In CIC aboard the lead escort, drift calculations began updating in real time. Controllers watched symbols shift across their overlays while radio traffic remained tightly compressed. Every transmission was reduced to heading, speed, correction, separation. No one was talking about fear. There was too much to manage. Inside one of the American ships, the tactical action officer leaned over the display as the jump picture continued to form. Surface contacts were still active. Iranian fast boats had not backed away. Coastal radar emissions continued to rise and fade in pulses from the shoreline. Nothing about the environment was safe. That was exactly why every second of the drop mattered. At 6:14, a small complication appeared. A group of jumpers along the southern edge of the formation began drifting farther than expected as a stronger crosswind caught them. Not wildly and not enough to disrupt the operation, but enough to demand an immediate correction. The adjustment calls moved through the net at once. Recovery timing shifted. One helicopter crew was reassigned to watch the lower edge of the descent pattern. On the shipboard displays, new lines were drawn, then updated again. Above the water, the paratroopers did what well-trained airborne troops are taught to do when conditions stop matching the plan. They corrected under canopy, widened slightly, then turned themselves back toward the intended assembly area with the kind of discipline that cannot be invented after the jump has already begun. Iranian crews saw that too. From their position on the water, this was clearly not a loose display and not a symbolic gesture. It was an insertion protected by layered aviation, watched by warships and adjusted in real time without visible confusion. That was the detail that changed the atmosphere. Not simply that American paratroopers were descending over Hormuz, but that the entire structure around them remained composed while it happened. At 6:15, one Iranian fast boat accelerated again. This time it edged toward the outer boundary of the drop zone, as if testing for a response. The movement was noticed immediately. Optical systems locked on. Range was called out. The MH-60 dropped lower and turned toward the contact, not striking, not rushing, simply making its presence impossible to miss. A warning was transmitted across the surface channel. Short, direct, final. The Iranian boat held course for several more seconds. Spray kicked high off its bow. Then its angle shifted. Not by much, but enough to show hesitation. The boat stayed outside the protected edge, still moving, still watching, but no longer closing with the same determination. That hesitation mattered because at the same moment, the first American paratroopers were landing. One after another, they came down across the designated surface and shoreline approaches with the hard, abrupt impact of a combat insertion. Chutes collapsed, harnesses were stripped away, weapons were secured close. Small groups formed almost immediately, each man moving toward the next task before the last canopy had fully settled. More jumpers followed behind them. By 6:16, the main body of the drop was nearly finished. The final sticks exited in disciplined sequence, while those already on the ground began consolidating into organized elements. Above them, the B-52s still remained in the wider area. Their role had not changed. Their silence was part of the pressure. On the water, Iranian boats continued circling at a distance, no longer charging blindly into uncertainty, no longer setting the tempo. They had not been engaged, they had not been hit. But the initiative they had tested for all morning was no longer theirs. The last parachutes opened high above the corridor. The last men descended, and with the drop nearly complete, the most dangerous phase still lay ahead, the moment when everyone on the water would decide what came next. 6:19 local time. Eastern edge of the Strait of Hormuz. The last parachutes were still collapsing on the ground when the struggle for the waterline began. Not an exchange of fire, not yet. A contest for distance, for nerve, for the right to keep moving without being forced into reaction. Inside the designated drop area, American paratroopers were already tightening into organized elements. Canopies were stripped away and dragged clear. Equipment bundles were recovered. Team leaders counted heads, checked spacing, and pushed men into the first defensive positions with the speed of a force that had expected no pause between landing and possible contact. What mattered now was no longer the jump itself. It was the first 3 minutes after it. Out on the water, U.S. ships adjusted almost invisibly. The lead escort held the main axis through the corridor, keeping its bow steady and its profile unchanged. A second warship widened the maritime screen by only a few degrees, enough to expand observation and close gaps in the surface picture without advertising a dramatic maneuver. The MH-60 that had been covering the drop zone lowered again and began flying a tighter pattern between the outer edge of the paratroopers' position and the nearest Iranian contacts. Higher above, ISR coverage remained fixed over the entire operating area. Everything American forces did in that minute served the same purpose: hold the shape, deny surprise, do not give away tempo. At 6:20, the Iranian side made its clearest move of the morning. 3 fast boats accelerated together from the northeastern sector, forming a shallow wedge as they cut across the water toward the outer boundary of the American activity zone. Their wakes brightened in parallel behind them. They were not drifting now. They were probing with intent. Fast enough to create pressure, controlled enough to preserve ambiguity. Inside CIC, the tracks were marked immediately. 3 fast contacts bearing 041, speed increasing. The tactical action officer did not look up. Project line. A projected intercept arc appeared across the display, stretching toward the maritime edge nearest the drop area. Not a direct collision course, not yet, but close enough to trigger the next layer of procedure. On the bridge, the captain watched through binoculars for a full second, then lowered them, warned them. The first surface warning went out over bridge-to-bridge frequency, clear and measured. U.S. forces were conducting military operations. Maintain safe separation. Do not enter the restricted area. No reply came back. The Iranian boats kept advancing. At 6:21, the MH-60 shifted nose on toward the wedge and dropped lower, rode awash, hammering the water as it moved into a position that could not be ignored. It did not strike. It did not posture wildly. It simply occupied the most useful piece of airspace between the approaching boats and the men who had just landed. That move changed the geometry. Now the Iranian crews had a helicopter ahead of them, warships off their flank, and optical systems tracking every meter of their approach. On American screens, laser range data, EO feeds, and radar plots all merged into one clean, narrowing problem. Range decreasing. Marking lead hull, 2,000 yards. The paratroopers ashore continued working without visible interruption. That was the discipline of the moment. Men on the ground built their perimeter while the sea threat developed in full view just beyond it. Nobody looked up and froze. Nobody paused, waiting for permission. Each element held its place in the sequence. At 6:22, the Iranian lead boat passed up the first off-ramp. Its bow stayed down. Its wake stayed hard. The 2 boats behind it adjusted slightly, tightening the wedge as if testing whether the Americans would move beyond warnings. The second warning went out. Shorter this time, closer to final. On the bridge of the U.S. escort, no one shouted. Helm stayed steady. Gun crews were ready, but not displayed theatrically. The destroyer's gray hull moved forward through blue water with the cold confidence of a ship that did not need to perform urgency in order to be dangerous. Then came the closest moment of the morning. At 6:23, the lead Iranian boat pushed just a little farther, enough to make every range call feel shorter than the one before it. The MH-60 crossed lower and more directly over its track, creating a wall of noise, spray, and unmistakable intent. At the same time, the American warship's sensors stayed locked. Every camera was recording. Every line had been measured. For 4 seconds, the boat kept coming. For 4 seconds, Hormuz seemed balanced on a single bad choice. Then the bow lifted. Throttle eased back. The lead boat lost speed. It was not dramatic. No skid, no panic turn, no public collapse, just a visible reduction of pressure, the smallest concession that still changed everything. Behind it, the other two boats hesitated for half a beat, then broke formation and peeled wider to port and starboard, no longer driving forward as a unified wedge. Inside CIC, nobody celebrated. They measured, lead contact slowing, trail contacts turning away, boundary holding. That was enough. At 6:24, the Iranian boats were still present, still armed, still watching, but they were no longer setting the edge of the encounter. The Americans had drawn the line, held it, and forced the probe to stop without a shot being fired. Ashore, the paratroopers completed their first consolidation. Accountability reports began moving. Outer security was established. The drop zone had become a controlled position instead of a vulnerable landing site. On the water, the MH-60 climbed slightly and resumed its screening orbit. The escorts held formation. The B-52s, now farther from the immediate center of events, continued moving away from the hottest part of the corridor. But their earlier presence still lingered over the operation like something no one could simply forget. By then, the most dangerous test had already passed. Not because the threat had disappeared, but because Iran had pressed against the boundary, reached it, and found no weakness there. Hormuz did not erupt into open battle that morning, but for the first time since the bombers appeared, Iranian movement had been forced to stop. 6:31 local time, Strait of Hormuz. By that point, the shape of the operation was no longer in question. The B-52s had begun easing out of the hottest section of the corridor, maintaining altitude as they moved away from the immediate center of activity. The heavy transports were already clear of the drop lane. Fighter cover remained overhead. The MH-60 continued its screening pattern above the waterline. On the surface, the American escorts kept steady formation. Ashore, the paratroopers who had entered the area only minutes earlier were no longer a force in descent. They were now an established presence. That was the moment the morning changed. Not with a missile launch, not with a collision, not with a shot across the bow. With completion, every major phase had been carried out inside one of the most compressed and dangerous maritime corridors in the world, and it had been carried out on schedule. The bombers arrived first and reshaped the air picture. The transports followed through that corridor while the sky was still under American control. The drop was carried out under observation, under pressure, and under active Iranian tracking. The waterline was tested, the boundary held, and now, at 6:31, the operation had moved from insertion to consolidation. Inside the Combat Information Center of the lead American escort, the atmosphere did not relax. It narrowed. Once the most dangerous moments pass in a professional military operation, the work does not disappear. It becomes more exact. Surface contacts were still under watch. Iranian boats remained scattered at a distance, no longer rushing forward, no longer probing in wedge formation, but still close enough to matter. Coastal emissions continued in uneven pulses from radar sites and command nodes ashore. Electronic surveillance operators logged every spike, every fade, every shift in pattern. The tactical picture remained crowded, but the center of gravity had changed. American forces now held the timing. On the bridge, the destroyer's captain kept his attention moving between the shipping lanes ahead and the sectors where the Iranian boats had fallen back. Merchant traffic still moved through the strait, a reminder that even on the edge of confrontation, commercial life in Hormuz never fully stops. That contrast made the scene sharper, not calmer. Civilian hulls moved through the same water where bombers, warships, helicopters, and airborne troops had just imposed a military equation. At 6:33, the first full accountability report came in from the paratroopers. Primary elements assembled, outer security established, landing sequence complete. No extra words followed, none were necessary. The report moved through the net with the weight of proof. What had entered the corridor by air had arrived intact, had formed on the ground, and had done so under direct observation from Iranian forces positioned around the operating area. That was the part the Iranian side had not been able to interrupt. They had seen the bombers, they had tracked the transports, they had watched the parachutes open, they had pushed fast boats toward the outer edge of the operation. And still, the sequence had continued exactly as planned. At 6:35, one Iranian patrol vessel altered course again, turning broadside for several seconds before settling into a parallel shadow farther from the American formation than before. It was still there, still armed, still watching, but distance itself had become a message. The close, sharper pressure that had defined the earlier minutes of the morning was gone. No one on the American side mistook that for surrender. It was something more useful than surrender. It was recognition of reality. The MH-60 climbed slightly and widened its orbit, no longer needing to block an immediate approach lane. On the destroyers, weapons crews stayed ready. Sensors remained fixed. Voice circuits stayed disciplined. Nothing about the American posture became casual, but the urgency had changed shape. It was no longer about preventing interference with the insertion. That had already been done. Now it was about preserving the result. Far above, the last visible trace of the B-52 presence was not sound, but structure. Even as the bombers moved outward from the corridor, their earlier role remained stamped across the entire operation. They had not needed to strike. They had not needed to descend. Their role had been fulfilled the moment they forced every radar, every patrol craft, and every Iranian decision-maker to look up and recalculate the geometry of the strait. But by the end, it was clear that the bombers had never been the whole message. The real message was sequence. American air power entered first and reshaped the sky. Protected transports moved through the corridor behind it. Paratroopers stepped into the wind and came down on schedule. Warships held the surface picture. A helicopter denied close approach. Iran tested the edges and found no opening. That was what happened. Not a dramatic detonation, not a sudden cinematic exchange. Something colder than that. Something harder to answer. Control. At 6:38, the tactical log aboard the lead escort showed a clean chain of recorded events. Bomber entry, corridor establishment, transport descent, jump initiation, drift correction, surface probe, warning sequence, Iranian deceleration, consolidation ashore. Time marks, bearings, speeds, distances, every minute fixed in data, every move preserved. No officer on the net declared victory. Professional forces rarely do in real time. The record was enough. By 6:40, the Iranian boats were still present on radar, but only as observers at the edge of a completed action. The American formation continued forward. The inserted troops held their ground. The corridor that had looked ready to ignite at dawn had instead been crossed, shaped, and used. And that was the final shock of the morning. Iran had prepared to watch the bombers. What entered Hormuz instead was a full American sequence, by air, by sea, and by timing. And for one long stretch of morning, over the narrowest waters in the Gulf, no one was able to stop it.